The following conversation is with Robert Panza, former policeman from California and current stem cell courier for the National Marrow Donor Program in the United States. As a former stem cell courier myself, I really look forward to this conversation, and on behalf of the whole EBMT Trainee Committee, I would like to sincerely thank Robert Panza for the quick response to our request. Robert Panza and all the other couriers out there across the world embody commitment and international collaboration. They transport a life-saving therapy literally around the world. But would Robert be here right now, he would probably underline that it is not about him, but the patients and the hero donor. But to every hero donor, there is a hero courier who navigates especially through these particularly challenging times with courageous calm, as he said. We talk about the National Marrow Donor Program, how Robert got into being a stem cell courier, what it means to him and in general, funny and sad stories, challenges and wonders since the pandemic. Robert Panza is also one of about 200 people across the USA who are volunteer NMDP ambassadors, advocating on behalf of cellular therapy patients and the NMDP with elected officials. They contact elected officials, usually on the federal level, and ask them to support legislation that funds and supports different aspects of bone marrow, stem cell, and cord blood therapy and transplantation. And now, enjoy this conversation with Robert Panza, who maybe is currently sitting in an economy seat right next to a stem cell product on the way to hope for a next patient.
You know, being a husband, a father, and a grandfather, I've always been the pride and center of my life, right behind those very, very important aspects of my life. Being a courier for the NMDP is right up there as well. So anytime I can share some of the information about cellular therapy, about the Be the Match here in the United States, and my honor and humbling experience and privilege to be a courier for the last 15 years. I love doing it. So thank you for the opportunity.
How did you get into being a stem cell courier?
Well, I will give you the short version as much as I can. My first involvement started about 16, 17 years ago. There was a gentleman that I worked with back then whose daughter, 19 years old, was diagnosed with a blood cancer. She needed a bone marrow transplant in order to save her life. As I'm sure you're aware, the first thing that doctors do is test family members, and is often the case 70% of the time, as we know, patients have to search a registry for an unrelated donor. So that was the case in her situation, and I want to share exactly what got me involved, who got me involved. This is Brandy. She was a beautiful 19-year-old young girl, high school athlete, college track and field star, who suddenly developed breathing problems. Took a while for the diagnosis to actually come about, but she was diagnosed with the blood cancer, needed a bone marrow transplant. Nobody in her family was a match, so they turned to Be the Match in order to try to find a match for Brandy. I was working at a police department at the time. I spent 30 years in the police force here in Los Angeles County. So I, along with some other people, including my daughter and some co-workers, organized a bone marrow registration drive in the hopes of finding a match for Brandy. Tragically, a match was never found for her, and she passed away at the young age of about 22. So as a result of that tragic story that unfortunately did not have a happy ending, I, along with my daughter, found out that the NMDP, the National Marrow Donor Program here in the United States, was creating a volunteer courier program where they were going to train members of the community in different geographic locations throughout the US to become volunteer couriers. So my daughter and I signed up to be couriers in September of 2006. And in the last almost 15 years or so that I've had the honor of being a courier for the NMDP, I've completed, honestly, I've lost track. I know it's in excess of about 350 or so volunteer courier trips. Once I retired back in 2008, I started branching out and doing international courier trips. So in the last 13 years or so, I've done, I think the count is about 74 international trips where either I've brought stem cells or bone marrow from the US, from US donors to patients in foreign countries, or as is more often the case, picking up cells from donors overseas and bringing them back to patients here in the US. Those 74 international trips have taken me to 5 continents, well in excess of 30 countries throughout the world.
Wow, that's a hell of a story. And what when I started being a courier, that was in med school, and what it was the same impression that I had at that time, just right after what you said, is there are so many topics no one really thinks about that comes along with being diagnosed with leukemia, and what happens then, and all these questions and all that surrounds this topic of donation, doing what you do. It's like when we discuss these things, we don't really, I think, often think about what really is behind that. Like what I understood right now is that you started volunteering for being a courier when you already or when you still worked as a police officer. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's a big deal to say, okay, I'll do that job aside from my usual work.
As it turns out, I honestly wasn't exactly sure what I was getting myself into as far as, I mean, I knew based on my experience with the situation with Brandy and educating myself as far as what the topic of bone marrow stem cell transplantation was all about, I knew that what I was going to be doing, what I, along with all of the other volunteer couriers, because by no stretch of the imagination am I the only one that does this. The NMDP has close to 800 couriers now who transport bone marrow stem cells literally all over the world. So my training, my experience as a police officer over 30 years has actually served me very well in my role as a volunteer courier, because as you know, being in the field and being a courier yourself, it is a stressful and at times can be very trying ordeal to make sure that those cells from that hero donor, wherever they happen to be, whether it's in the next city or the next county or the next continent, make sure that they get to that patient in need as safely and expeditiously as possible. So I honestly tell people that over the course of the last 15 years doing this as a courier, I keep Brandy on my shoulder. Her memory, her legacy is right there with me on each and every courier trip that I've completed. In my opinion, is a tribute, as part of Brandy's legacy. She has gone on to touch so many people's lives that she'll never know. I keep in contact with her parents and let them know that Brandy's legacy, even though she's been gone now for over 15 years, her story, her legacy has touched so many people's lives, literally throughout the world.
Could you just elaborate a bit on how, or as far as you know, how this NMDP system is coordinated, how you get your contacts, how things are working in your country?
Sure, absolutely. Well, let me start with a little bit of history of the volunteer courier program with the NMDP. And actually, if I may, I'll even back up a tad bit further and talk briefly about the history of the National Marrow Donor Program. As you're probably aware, the NMDP has been around for well over 30 years. The first bone marrow transplant was conducted in the late 1980s. A young girl by the name of Laura Graves was diagnosed with leukemia, and at the time they were experimenting with the possibility of transplanting healthy stem cells, healthy bone marrow from a donor to a patient suffering with some type of blood disease, whether it be leukemia, lymphoma, sickle cell, or now one of 70 other diseases for which a bone marrow, stem cell, or cord blood transplant may honestly be the patient's only chance of survival. So it's critically important. So the NMDP has been around for well over 30 years. In that 30-year history, the NMDP has facilitated well over 108,000 bone marrow, stem cell, and cord blood transplants in the 30-plus year history. So in the early 2000s, the NMDP realized that they needed a way to get cells from that hero donor, wherever they may be located, to the patient's bedside. So at first, they used NMDP employees. Sometimes they would use staff members from either the donor center or the transplant center to transport those cells from the donor center to the transplant center. As the number of transplants began to increase over the years, they realized that they needed to get additional people trained in order to transport those cells. So in the early 2000s, they started a volunteer courier program. My daughter and I had the privilege of being one of the first classes that was trained here in California on the West Coast of the United States. Since then, the NMDP has gone on to bring on board what is now over 800 couriers located throughout the country. So the way the process works is when a transplant is organized and scheduled, the NMDP will send out an email to couriers within a specific geographic location. The NMDP is all about trying to be as efficient and economical as possible for the patient's benefit's sake. So what the NMDP will try to do is they will send an email to couriers who are located geographically close to where either the donor center is or where the transplant center is, just to try to save and cut down on transportation costs. So those emails go out, and if you are available to sign up for one of those trips, you respond to the email saying, I can take that trip. And if you get assigned, then within about a week or so prior to the actual first day of collection, the travel department that the NMDP hosts will contact you and work out your itinerary for flight schedule, hotel, car service if need be. So there are a lot of logistics that goes into every courier trip, not just with finding the donor, obviously, which is the most important, matching the patient to the donor. But once that is all organized, then it's a matter of trying to find a courier who is able to facilitate that transportation.
And is this being a courier, is that completely voluntary? So people can just sign up and they will be integrated, or is there like something like a selection process or?
Well, there's a selection process. The NMDP is not currently soliciting or looking for any additional couriers. Like I said, there's about 820 couriers that the NMDP has right now. About 73% of the 820 are volunteer couriers. So the way that it worked when the NMDP was in fact looking for volunteer couriers, people would send an email to the staff at the NMDP expressing an interest in being a courier. And then it was just a matter of when they were going to be organizing a training class, they would select some people in certain geographic areas. Their goal is to make sure that they have enough couriers spread throughout the United States to help with transportation in the most efficient and economical way possible. So once a new class of volunteer couriers is selected, then it used to be that the NMDP would go out to wherever that hub or that group of volunteers lived and would conduct the training in person. Obviously, over the course of the last year with COVID, all of that initial courier training takes place remotely via Zoom.
Okay. And maybe just for all out there who don't really, who always, because in Germany, what my impression is, there is this promotion of donation and people, this is a curative option for people with leukemia and other hematologic diseases. And this is always supported somehow with a feeling of like pride and emotions, etc. But people sometimes, when I talk to my friends and told them how I really go to the center and how this really works, they were like, okay, but that's not what I expected. So maybe it's good that you walk us through like when you start your transport and how like one transportation really works for you. Sure. Like a usual transportation.
Okay, absolutely. First and foremost, all of the medical information, all of the information about the donor and the patient are confidential. As couriers, we do not see names, typically date of births, or any identifying information whatsoever about either the donor or the patient. So once we receive the emails, and it depends upon how many trips they put out a week. Sometimes there'll be 5, 6, 7, or 8 emails a day soliciting couriers for courier trips. Sometimes there could be as many as 10 or 15. It just all depends. So if you put in for a courier trip and you're selected, they'll respond with an email saying, okay, this is your trip. About a week or so prior to the first day of collection, you'll be contacted by the travel department, work out your itinerary, and then you'll receive paperwork, usually via email, that explains exactly where the donor center is that you're going to be going to, and where the transplant center is, along with any special instructions regarding that particular transportation. There's always information included in the courier paperwork that explains the process for which the cells need to be transported. And by that, I mean either cooled or room temperature. Typically, all of the transportation that we do as couriers is in cooled conditions. I have right here my courier tote
Nice.
bag
Perfect.
that I carry with me literally all over the world. Within the courier tote bag is
Great. Yeah.
the actual courier, tote, which I'm sure you're very, very familiar with as well.
You got one for your own like work. This is your personal bag then.
Yes, correct.
Great. Okay. Nice.
So that has accompanied me well in excess of 2 million miles in the air. I've literally stopped keeping track, but I know that it's well over a couple million miles traveling in the air. So we'll go on the date of the collection. We'll go to the donor center at the appointed time. Obviously, make sure that the information that we have in our paperwork, as far as the patient ID number, the donor ID number, matches up. Like I said, everything is confidential, everything is anonymous. If our delivery instructions, if the transplant center is at a pediatric hospital, for instance, then it doesn't take me 30 years experience as a police officer to realize that, okay, in this particular trip, the patient is likely a child. So all trips obviously are critically important because someone's life is hanging in the balance. When you know you're delivering to a pediatric hospital, there's something even more urgent about making sure that those cells get to that patient as safely and expeditiously as possible. So at the donor center, like I said, we match up the paperwork. We make sure that all of the accompanying paperwork that goes with the transplant is with the product, the declaration of eligibility, the infectious disease markers, and other paperwork that accompanies each and every transplant. We make sure we have all that. We bundle it all up, make sure we look around 2 or 3 times that we don't leave anything behind. And then the excitement begins as far as making sure that those cells are protected. They are by our side each and every minute along the journey until we get to the transplant center. Getting through the airport, we've got paperwork that explains exactly what we're transporting, the conditions under which it needs to be transported, the fact that cells, whether it be bone marrow or stem cells, cannot be x-rayed. So we've got paperwork that gets us through, in the US, the Transportation Security Administration, the people at the airport will sometimes not be exactly sure what we're doing or what it is that we're transporting. So there has been some interesting exchanges at security lines at airports, trying to explain, no, you cannot x-ray this product. So fortunately, I've never had too much of a problem. I've had to spend a little extra time sometimes explaining why they can't be x-rayed. So depending upon the airport, sometimes they'll take the product bags actually out of the cooler and run the cooler through the x-ray machine, which is okay. But we make sure that at no time do those precious cells leave our site. We don't want there to be any accidents where cells actually get put through the X-ray machine, which, as we know, can severely degrade the actual product itself. So once we get through the airport, it's time to board the plane. Depending upon the type of airplane, sometimes there are small commuter planes, and the overhead luggage compartment can be a little bit small. So there's times where we have to be somewhat creative in where we store the cooler. It cannot go in the cargo hold of airplanes. That's why it has to be carried on at all times. Airline personnel, for the most part, once you explain what it is that you're transporting and that it has to be within close proximity to you, I've never had a problem with airline crew not trying to facilitate. Sometimes they'll put the cooler in the closet at the front of the aircraft if need be. Although I've never had it happen, I've heard of couriers who have had to actually allow the cooler to be placed in the cockpit with the pilots because there was no other place to put it on the plane. I've also been able to, if the luggage compartment will not accommodate the cooler, I've been able to have the seat next to me empty, and I will seat belt it next to me. And sometimes, like I said, you have to be a little bit creative. It used to be that coolers could fit under the seat in front of you, but over the years, it seems like between entertainment systems and other accessories in the plane, the under seat space has been somewhat reduced. So usually ideally in the luggage compartment overhead, so it's within an arm's reach from you, or in a closet in front, but it's always in close proximity to you. We've been instructed that if we were to ever board an airplane and the overhead compartments would not accommodate the coolers, there was no place on board, that we would get off that plane before the boarding door closed and try to find another flight. Fortunately, I've never had to do that, but I understand that other couriers have had to. So we're on our way to the transplant center. We try to get nonstop flights whenever possible to make sure that those cells get to the transplant center as quickly and expeditiously as possible. Depending upon where you're going, sometimes that's possible, other times it's not, especially transporting cells internationally. There's been many times where I've had to leave, whether it be Europe or Asia, and could only get so far. There were flight schedules because we fly typically just commercial airlines. We're kind of at the mercy of commercial airline schedules. So sometimes we'll have to keep the product in the cooler with us overnight at some location, simply because there were no direct flights that could get us to the transplant center as quickly as possible. So once we arrive at the transplant center, head directly to either the stem cell lab, sometimes it's the blood bank, wherever the instructions tell us to go is where we show up with those cells in hand, and make sure that whoever we're handing the product off to, we go over the paperwork. We make sure that the donor ID, the recipient ID, all the paperwork is there, all the numbers match, and then we hand it over, and it's out of our hands at that point.
Can you remember your first transport?
I can. Actually, it was fairly local. it was within the same state that I live. It was within California. It was a number of years ago. So I'm not breaching any confidentiality by being too specific about that particular transport, but it was a relatively, couple-hour flight from where the donor center was to where the transplant center was. I remember arriving at the transplant center late at night, and I was still in complete awe that I had the privilege of playing just a tiny little part in helping save someone's life. So I remember that first courier trip very well, despite it being close to 15 years ago.
Yeah, because me as well. And when I remember this, and that's what I think it's very, very important that you are on, is that this is a job for me personally that nobody really thinks about, but has so much like weight.
Yes.
And so much influence for people's lives, actually. And this was like the strongest feeling I had was in that first transport, when I sat down in that chair in the seat of the flight, and I was just like shivering. Okay, let's be no problem. Let's get safe to that hospital. And that was quite, on the one hand, I was quite like anxious. On the other hand, I was just really grateful that something like this exists, actually.
Exactly. Yep. And with the National Marrow Donor Program volunteer couriers, all of us seem to have some personal connection with the NMDP or Be the Match. I personally know lots of couriers who either are donors themselves, have been recipients. I know couriers whose family members have received bone marrow or stem cell transplants. So most all of the couriers have some personal connection, some personal story with where their passion derives from, as far as the work that not just the NMDP, but the cooperating registries throughout the world, because the NMDP, although it's the U.S. bone marrow registry, the NMDP is, as you're well aware of, is just one of many registries throughout the world that cooperate with one another to make sure that the broadest base of donors is available for patients in need. As you're probably aware, the NMDP has well over 20 million people here in the US that are on the registry, with access to several million more on cooperating registries throughout the entire world. All of the registries combined have well over 37 million potential donors that can be accessed by patients who, like you said, suffer from leukemia, lymphoma, sickle cell, or one of 70 other blood diseases and disorders for which a bone marrow or stem cell or cord blood transplant may be their single last chance of survival. So it's really an awesome experience. Like I said, I am fortunate to be able to do this. I'm fortunate to have a background in law enforcement, having been, a police officer for over 30 years. As you can imagine, I've been involved in more than a few stressful situations. So I've taken what I've learned and what I've experienced in those situations to be able to harness, if you will, the stress and anxiety that comes from, whether it be on a courier trip where I might miss a flight because of a late pickup at a donor center. Instead of becoming too anxious and stressing out, I'll try to have what I call courageous calm, instead of using the energy to stress out about whether I'm going to make that flight, especially in a situation where I have absolutely no control over. There have been lots of situations where the pickup at the donor center has run late. I'll have to board a train, for instance, or jump in a taxi in order to get to the airport. If I'm running late, I can't make that taxi driver drive any faster than is safe. I can't make that train arrive at the airport any faster than it already can. So instead of using that stress in an unproductive manner, I'll try to focus on, okay, what are my options? If in fact I can't make this flight because I just can't get to the airport in time, what are my options? So as I'm sure all other couriers have to do, I'm sure you've done it a number of times yourself, you'll have to become very resourceful. Consider what your options are, come up with a plan. So as soon as you're able, as soon as you get to the airport or wherever you happen to be, you know exactly what you need to do in order to make sure that those cells get to that transplant center quickly.
Completely agree. But what I also observed was when I first had a career trip to Washington, D.C., I was very, very late with the pickup, because there was one clinical problem with the patient who donated the stem cells, and that was one like typical situation where that was another experience that I made in that job, is that people that you might have like stereotypes with when you're not experienced, that they recognize the situation, see that is some kind of important what you just do, and that they help you in an extraordinary way. So I was late and I told the taxi driver, I really need to get that flight because that was the last flight from Washington DC to Europe.
Right.
And he did everything, and we got like on time. Yeah. And that was really these kind of little stories that were so resonating with me in that job. That's really something.
Exactly. Having been a cop for as long as I did, as you can well imagine, cops don't always have the best view of human nature, because of what we have to do. We don't always see the best side of human nature. So I try to keep that in check. I try to keep that in the proper perspective. But with that being said, like you, I have relied on the goodness and the kindness of so many people throughout the world. As in your situation with the taxi driver, I cannot begin to tell you how many times I've been, typically in foreign countries, where I will jump in a taxi as soon as I arrive at the airport. And it's typically when I'm delivering cells, or even sometimes, when I'm there to pick up cells, I'll get in the taxi and I will get to wherever the donor center is or the transplant center, depending if I'm picking up or dropping off. And as you are well aware, so many hospitals are the size of small cities. So while the courier instructions are as detailed as they possibly can be, sometimes they're a little bit lacking with specific buildings, specific floors, and so forth and so on. So taxi drivers have become my new best friends. I can't begin to tell you how many times I'll arrive at a hospital campus or a complex that, like I said, is just huge. And signs directing where to go are not in English. So I have had taxi drivers accompany me into hospitals, walk down hallways, walk down corridors, get in elevators with me, climb stairs to make sure that I get to where I need to go. So I have really benefited from being able to look for the best in people, and just like you said, just reach out. You can't be too specific with exactly what you're doing because of confidentiality, as we know, and so forth. So I can't go into too much detail with taxi drivers, but like you said, you can certainly get the message across that what you're carrying in that cooler is extremely important. And I've had people help me quite a bit. So I'm truly fortunate.
It's really interesting that you say that, because for me it was completely the same, and it was simply because I couldn't tell so many details about my work. Then I got to know taxi drivers. I cannot tell you how many life stories I heard when I just came into a new country, and then I got a full experience of that new country from that taxi driver. He told me everything and asked me about Germany, etc. And these, sure. I really, since then, I really appreciate taxi drivers. I cannot stress that out enough, really.
Exactly. There's been the overwhelming experience has been positive. There has been a couple times where a taxi driver has taken me to the hospital campus, and I remember this one time, and ironically we were in Germany at the time, and the taxi driver, I could tell, was getting a little bit frustrated because the instructions that I had to get to the specific lab, the specific building that I needed to be, the instructions weren't exactly clear. I don't remember if the lab had moved or what. So I provided him the information. I called up the lab and had the taxi driver talk to the lab technician and have the lab technician direct the taxi driver where we needed to go. But it was still difficult to find. So there were more than a couple times where the taxi driver said, look, this is as far as I can get you. You get out here and you'll be able to find where you need to go on your own. Just, you'll be able to find it. It's like, no, I appreciate that, but I'm not getting out of this taxi until I know exactly where the building is, and it's within a short walk of me. So that time, I didn't have to be rude. I just had to make sure that the importance of what I was doing was conveyed to that taxi driver, and that I was not going to be talked into getting out and then having to wander around this huge complex trying to find where I needed to go. So he may not have been really happy with me by the time I got out, but that's okay.
Yeah, but this also, the whole discussion also reflects that when we work as couriers, or we work for couriers, we really recognize at that time what really international collaboration is, because it's always talked about, yeah, we need to collaborate with other countries, etc., be open-minded, etc. But when you do a job like a courier, then you know what you're talking about when you talk about collaboration. How many, so where have you been, like from Asia to Australia to Latin America? Have you seen all continents, or?
I've been to 5 of the 7 continents on Earth. I have not been to Africa yet. Occasionally there'll be a courier trip to South Africa. I just haven't been able to work out the logistics to be able to put in for a courier trip to Africa yet. But I've been to Asia a number of times, China 4 times, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, so Asia, Australia. The first time I had a courier trip to Australia was to Perth, which is, as we know, is Western Australia. So living on the West Coast of the United States, I thought, well, okay, I'm going from the West Coast of the United States to the West Coast of Australia. So how long a trip can that be? That can't be that bad. Well, as it turns out, the donor center where I was going to be delivering cells, the donor was in Western Australia. The patient at that time was on the East Coast of the United States. So I remember getting the trip and talking to the travel people at the NMDP, and one of them said, you know what, Bob, you couldn't get any further apart between the donor center and the transplant center. So that particular trip, I remember I left LAX, flew to Brisbane, Australia, 12, 13 hours. I think I had about a 5-hour layover in Brisbane, and then, as you're aware, another 5-hour flight across the Australian continent to get to the west coast of Australia. The trip coming back with cells took close to 35 hours. That was between time in the air, layovers, and ultimately getting to the donor center. By the time I dropped off at the donor center and flew back home, I had completed 23,000 miles, 23,000 air miles. I was curious at the time, well, gosh, how long is it around the entire globe at the equator? So I did my research and found out that the distance around the globe at the equator is about 25,000 miles. So
Wow. Yeah.
on that courier trip, I traveled, and it's not about me. It's about the cells, it's about the donor, it's about the patient. But to me, it just demonstrated the lengths that, in this case, the NMDP, the cooperating bone marrow registry in Australia, the donor, and all of the myriad of people behind the scenes, the length, the extent at which people will go to make sure that that patient gets a second chance at life, thanks to cellular therapy. So in that particular case, I could literally and figuratively say that that we would travel around the world to make sure that those cells get to that patient in need. On international courier trips, they'll always schedule a primary flight to get the cells from the donor center to the transplant center. They'll also do a backup flight just in case there's a problem, there's a late pickup, or the primary flight gets canceled or delayed. You can jump on the backup flight. In this particular case, I remember it was kind of funny to think of, okay, the primary flight, if I was able to get on the primary flight, we would make a right turn out of Australia to go around the globe in one direction. The backup flight, we would make a left turn going out of Australia and then travel around the other side of the globe in order to get to the donor center. But fortunately, everything worked out. It was a lot of hours wedged into an economy airline seat. But what I tell people, and what I honestly feel, as do all of my fellow couriers, whether they be volunteers or staff members, that it's our honor, it's our privilege to be able to do this. And I know, given the opportunity, that patient laying in that hospital bed would trade places with me in a heartbeat if they could. They would trade their hospital bed for that little bitty tiny economy airline seat. They would trade that hospital food for airline food in a heartbeat if they could. They can't. So it's our honor and privilege to be able to step up and be able to do this for so many people around the world.
Absolutely. And how are you affected now since last year? So
how much time do we have? And I'll be as brief and concise as I possibly can. But
you can definitely take your time. I will stay at home. I'm at home, so I've got time.
Okay. Well, I want to make this as interesting as possible, but also to demonstrate the lengths at which the people, not just at the NMDP, that are based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but other donor centers, transplant centers, cooperating registries, the lengths that they have gone to make sure that regardless of a worldwide pandemic, that the transplants that are scheduled still took place. And it's amazing. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about my experience during COVID. As it turns out, I had a courier trip last year, 2020, the end of February, beginning of March, international trip, picking up cells. I found myself going to a location that arguably was the epicenter of COVID-19 in Europe. I can't be any more specific than that, but believe me when I say that it was ground zero. It was all across every media outlet about how this particular region was being so hard hit by COVID-19. Being late February, early March, of course, the world was still grappling with, okay, what exactly is this? How bad is it going to get? How deadly is it going to be? How contagious? All of those unknown factors. And so I found myself heading to a place that was, like I said, the epicenter. It was interesting. When I arrived, the government authorities were just starting to implement protocols as far as arriving airline passengers, what we had to do. Our temperatures were scanned. As soon as we got off the plane, we were given instructions to go directly to our hotels, quarantine, isolate ourselves as much as we possibly could. And it was interesting, the hotel that I went to, that they had scheduled for me in the pickup city where the donor center was, there was a group of Americans that were just completing about a 3-week tour in that particular region. So they did not know, they had no clue as to the extent of the media coverage in the United States They knew that there was something called COVID, but it was interesting as I explained to them from a safe distance in the lobby of this hotel what was transpiring back in the US. So that particular trip, I am happy to say, was completely uneventful, notwithstanding all of the uncertainty at the beginning stages of the COVID pandemic. So got to the donor center, which was a hospital in this particular city. Picked up uneventfully, got back to the airport, jumped on a plane, had a connecting flight that took me through actually a city in Germany. So got off the plane in Germany. We had to remain sort of isolated before we boarded our next flight back to the US. And I am happy and relieved to say that got through that trip completely unscathed, uneventful. There were no delays whatsoever in getting the cells to that patient. Once I arrived home, the NMDP said, okay, you've been to this particular location, so we're going to have to put you on the sidelines. You're going to have to quarantine for a period of, initially it was 30 days. And then as the days went on, as the weeks went on, it became a lot more evident. This is now in March of last year, became a lot more evident that flights were being canceled. Couriers, volunteer couriers who had compromised immune systems, either because having been patients and recipients themselves, they had to be sidelined because just of the uncertainty of having a compromised immune system. So the number of available couriers dropped by almost 40%, 40 to 50% within a very, very short period of time, within a matter of a couple of weeks. So the NMDP had to become very, very creative in how they made sure that transportation still took place. I think it was around March 19th or so, the president of the US at that time implemented the travel ban that basically prevented any foreign nationals from entering the US. And so, as you're aware, a lot of donors that donate to patients here in the US come from Germany. A significant portion, well over 50% of all of the transplants that take place for US patients take place as a result of donors from foreign countries. So a significant number of transplants involve international travel. So once the president implemented that travel ban, the logistics people at the NMDP, a couple specific individuals who were responsible, had to scramble around. So all of a sudden, all of the German couriers who up to that point had been transporting cells to the US were no longer able to enter the US because of the travel ban. So within a matter of a couple days, the NMDP put out the word to all of the couriers and said, look, is there anybody who could leave like tomorrow to go to a number of different countries in Europe to pick up cells? So couriers who had never done any international travel before on international courier trips were raised their hands and said, send me, I'll go. So there were dozens and dozens and dozens of courier trips that took place within a very, very short period of time. And not one transplant was delayed or missed as a result of the travel ban. The NMDP had to go to extraordinary lengths, including securing private airfields in foreign countries because international airports were closed. The NMDP put the word out to corporate America and private pilots as well, people who own their own airplanes, and corporations. Lockheed Martin stepped up and said, we've got corporate jets, we'll transport couriers from the US to whatever foreign country that you need. And so Lockheed Martin stepped up, offered their corporate jet. There were a number of trips that took place thanks to the generosity of corporate America. I was on a couple private jets, one of them being the Lockheed Martin corporate jet. I was on another courier trip that was a gentleman owned his own plane, and because travel was so limited, commercial airline flights, as you're aware, were being canceled just by the droves. So if it were not for the generosity of corporate America and the private plane owners and pilots, those transports would have been extremely, extremely difficult. So it doesn't matter. Continents, mountain ranges did not, or pandemics did not cause an interruption in any of the transportation of those precious cells whatsoever. The NMDP also formulated a new process for getting cells delivered from Europe specifically. They created what they referred to as a hub and spoke model, which means that donor centers in Europe, whether they be in Germany, Spain, Italy, Poland, wherever the donor is located in Europe, what the NMDP ended up doing is they would use private courier services to get the cells from wherever the donor center was located, regardless of the country, regardless of the city. They would get those cells via a private courier service to a central location in Germany, typically Frankfurt. Once those cells arrived in Frankfurt, they were loaded into the cargo hold of a Lufthansa airplane. They were then flown over to the US to a specific location, Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The cells were delivered to the cargo facility, and then because domestic air transportation was still, although it was difficult, you were still able, if you lived in the US, to travel to Chicago. So once those cells arrived in Chicago, a number of couriers, the US couriers, would essentially descend upon the cargo facility at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, pick up the boxes that those cells were contained in, and then would distribute them to whatever part of the country those cells were destined to be. So since then, there have literally been, I'm not sure the exact number, but it's got to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these hub and spoke courier trips that have taken place. I've done, I think, probably 25. I leave this coming Monday for another hub and spoke trip. So it is, it's been truly remarkable, the extent to which the NMDP, its staff, and volunteer couriers have gone to make sure that those transplants still take place. I'm happy to report, and still in some amount of astonishment, that despite the pandemic, despite everything that the pandemic caused, 2020 saw the most number of transplants ever facilitated by the NMDP in its 30-year history. Over 6,600 lives were impacted as a result of the creative thinking of the NMDP, cooperative agents, registries throughout the entire world. March of last year, March 2020, as the pandemic raged across the world, it was the single highest number of transplants ever facilitated by the NMDP in its 30-year history. It's truly a testament to the dedication, the passion, and the drive of everybody involved in the bone marrow stem cell transplantation profession.
That's remarkable. Yeah. Wow. Okay. What can you say to that? That's just.
I can tell you how eerie it was. You probably have similar experiences. How eerie it was in my case to go to LAX, which had always been extremely busy. To go to LAX, have it deserted, to get on commercial airplanes that could hold 200-300 people and be the single only passenger on that plane. That happened numerous times. Other couriers stepped up and completed courier trips despite the potential risk to themselves. And I have to say that the NMDP has always been extremely supportive of couriers, volunteer and staff members as well. They have always provided training, support, equipment, supplies, anything to make us couriers feel that we were safe, that we were well taken care of and supported. There's always people that we can contact via telephone if we ever run into a situation where we're just not sure about a particular situation. There are always NMDP staff members who are readily available to talk us through situations and help us along the way.
How long will you do that?
As long as I'm physically able to.
Mm-hmm.
There was a mandatory retirement age that has since been lifted, just because they realized that just because you reach 70, which I still have a way to go, you were still able to safely transport cells. So they've completely lifted the mandatory retirement age. And the retirement age obviously was intended to make sure that couriers were safe and able to make sure that the cells got where they needed to be. As you know, there's been more than a few times where I've had to break out into pretty much a full-on run to get, whether it be a connecting flight, whether it be to, get to a taxi or whatever the situation was. You have to, there's an amount of physical stamina that one must possess in order to be able to safely do this.
Wow, yeah, that's perfectly put. It's sometimes I felt like totally mayhem, but on the same what you said is courageous calm. I think it's a beautiful word for that, because you know what you're doing, you know it's important, and you just need to get it done. And that on the same hand is just calming you down. Yeah. Somehow. I don't know how it works physically, but it is that.
Exactly. So true. Yep. So true. It has really been an honor to be able to do this. To play just a small little part. People who know what I do as a volunteer typically always ask me, "Gosh, do you have any horror stories? Do you have any situations that really were terrifying and didn't turn out well?" And I honestly have to say no. I have been extremely fortunate. Like I said at the outset, 350 plus courier trips. And, there, as I'm sure you've probably experienced as well, there's been situations where flights have gotten delayed, flights have gotten canceled. I remember one particular situation probably at least 12 years ago, where I had a courier trip and I was transporting cells to the Midwest of the United States. It was winter, and I left the airport close to the donor center because of weather. There were flight delays. I had a connecting flight. My arriving flight was late, which meant that my connecting flight left without me. I missed it by probably only a few minutes, but nonetheless, it was gone. It had taken off. I remember that sinking feeling, running to the gate, thinking, okay, please still be there. I was hoping that because the weather had delayed my incoming flight, that my next outgoing flight, departing flight, would be late as well. Unfortunately, it wasn't. So I had to call the transplant center. And I knew, like I had said earlier, although patient and donor information is all confidential, I knew my delivery instructions were to a pediatric hospital. So I knew, okay, this is a child. This is probably a child whose donor cells are in my cooler that I cannot get to tonight. So I called the transplant center, told them I was going to be delayed, called travel, the travel organization, the NMDP, and they said, yeah, there's no flights out tonight. I said, gosh, can I rent a car? Can I still somehow get to where I needed to go, despite it being snowing, despite the road conditions, I'm sure, being just completely horrendous? And they said, no, the best that we can do is put you up in a hotel for the night. We'll have you on the first flight out in the morning. So you'll get to the donor center probably about 12 hours later than originally scheduled. So I remember that being an extremely long night in the hotel, knowing that the cooler that was right next to the bed contained the cells from that hero donor that was going to give that child a second chance at life. So don't think I slept much that night, but that's okay. Got to the airport the next morning in plenty of time, got on the flight. And I remember walking into the transplant center with those cells, like I said, about 12 hours later than originally scheduled. And the nurse who took receipt of the cells, I'll never forget, they said, oh, yeah, the patient's parents were here last night. They were pacing the floor every 5 minutes. They kept asking, is the courier here yet? Is the courier here yet with the cells? And so the nurse said, we had to tell them that you got delayed, that the weather prevented you from getting on the connecting flight and so forth. So I remember, I was elated that I was able to finally get to the transplant center, but at the same time, I still remember that sinking feeling, thinking what the patient and the patient's parents must have been going through, finding out that my arrival was going to be delayed, and so that's been probably the most significant story as far as any delays that I've experienced over the last 15 years. It's also made me stop and think a lot about patients over the course of this last year, how so many of them awaiting their transplant probably cannot have family members by their bedside because of COVID restrictions and so forth. And just imagining what it must be like for them, and taking some degree of comfort knowing, well, okay, regardless of what's going on in the world, those cells from that hero donor, that donor who has stepped forward, regardless of any real or perceived threat to them, they've still stepped up and have decided to go through with the donation and given that patient a second chance at life. It's really an inspiring story of human nature, and being able to be just a small little player in that, as well as all of my hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other fellow couriers, is really, truly remarkable.
You always keep saying like a hero donor, but I think with every hero donor, there's a hero courier, and I mean that. I think donation without couriers is also nothing, and that's why it's very, very, I'm very, very grateful that you agreed to having this conversation, and well, it's a real pleasure to have you on.
I appreciate it. From one fellow courier to another, I know you know exactly what it's like to be able to walk into that transplant center, and I have to admit, it's always a relief to hand the cells over to the medical professionals, and I know that you wear two hats in that respect, courier and medical professional as well. And I always credit the medical professionals and the people behind the scenes. And it's okay. It's absolutely okay that patients probably have very little understanding or knowledge or familiarity with what goes into facilitating a transplant, from the medical side to the logistical side to so forth. That's okay. They don't need to know all of the details. They just need to know that there are people willing and able to provide them the assistance, driven by passion to further the medical understanding of cellular therapy, to make sure that as many people as possible receive the cells that they need. Here in the United States, the NMDP is working extremely hard to further diversify the US registry. As I know that you know, a patient is most likely to find a match from somebody who shares their same race and ethnicity. Here in the US, if you are of Caucasian descent, if you're white, the chances of finding a match on the US registry are about 77%. If you're American Indian or Alaska Native, your chances of finding a match are about 57%. people of Hispanic origin. In Brandy's case, the young woman who tragically was never able to find a match 16 years ago, she was Hispanic. Hispanics are underrepresented on the registry, so that reduced her likelihood of finding a match, and tragically she didn't. So Hispanics have only a 46% chance of finding a match. Asian Pacific Islanders have about a 41%. If you're Black, if you're African American, diagnosed with leukemia, lymphoma, sickle cell, or one of the other 70 or so blood diseases and disorders, and you need a transplant, your chances of finding a match currently are only about 23%. So the NMDP, as I'm sure other registries across the entire world, are working extremely hard to make sure that the registry, that donors, that we have a more diversified base of donors. So regardless of your race, regardless of your ethnicity, you have a chance of finding a match to save your life. So that's really the, one of the primary focuses that drives the NMDP, and I'm sure other cooperating registries across the country, to diversify our registries.
Absolutely, absolutely. What is your next flight? Where is it going? Or you can't say anything about that, right?
Well, I can tell you that it's a hub and spoke.
Okay.
So I'm going to be leaving on Monday, flying to Chicago, picking up on Tuesday, and then on another plane to another city here in the US to deliver cells from some anonymous hero donor, whether they be in Germany or some other European country. I know that it's coming from the European continent. And so that's my next trip.
So I wish you all the best for your next trip.
Thank you.
And I really, really would like to thank you to agreeing to this conversation and to being on time, to communicate easily. And it's so odd to speak to people without seeing them in real life, in person. But I think this also, like what you already discussed, is that people find a way for communication, for helping each other out. And that's exactly what you did for us, for the young trainees in Europe, and to get this, to get the word out there. And I would definitely try to combine a hero donor with a hero courier, because I think that's what you are, just to be honest.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that I'm so passionate about, because I know that if I were ever to need a transplant, or God forbid, my wife, children, or grandchildren, there would be medical professionals who have the expertise, the passion to work as hard as humanly possible to make sure that there is a cure, and that there's common everyday people like myself who are willing and able to step up and do what they can to help play a little part in saving somebody's life. So Nico, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about being a volunteer courier, the passion that I hope I was able to express, and I hope does help some benefit to those couriers coming up as well. So thank you.